The manager is responsible for ordering inventory, setting employee schedules, and handling customer complaints. In this video, we're going to be looking at the proper use for colons. And here we've got a colon seemingly to introduce a list of activities or things that the manager is responsible for. So it may seem good, it may seem like it flows and all fits together. But this actually breaks a very important rule, and this is the main rule with colons. The sentence before the colon must be an independent clause, must be a complete sentence. As we'll talk about, what comes after the colon is kind of irrelevant. It could be anything. But before the colon, you don't want to have a non-dependent, you don't want to have anything other than an independent clause, right? I couldn't walk up to you and say, the manager is responsible for, I mean, on one level, it's an independent clause, but I wouldn't say it's a complete sentence. It's not a complete thought. In fact, we don't need this colon here at all. We can just say the manager is responsible for ordering inventory, setting employee schedules, and on, no problem. So the main thing, the thing before the colon, it's got to be a complete independent sentence. His favorite sports teams are the Rangers, the Yankees, the Giants, and the Knicks. Again, we don't need this. We can just say his favorite sports teams are the Rangers, the Yankees, blah, 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 blah. This is not a complete independent sentence. I can't walk up to you and say his favorite sports teams are. I guess technically it's an independent clause, but it's not a complete thought. It's not a complete sentence. His favorite sports teams are what, right? So only use a colon before a complete sentence. So colons must follow an independent clause, but basically anything can follow a colon. And we can look at some examples. Colons, as we've seen, can introduce a list. So I have 3 hobbies. Notice this is a complete independent sentence. Eating fancy food, driving fancy cars, and buying mansions. Colons can also use to connect 2 independent clauses, just like a semicolon, just like a comma and a conjunction. And you do this particularly when the second sentence is explaining or expanding on the first. So for example, I never thought I'd see the day, colon, my cat graduated from college. So 2 complete sentences. This first one is introducing the second, and the second gives more information on what we read in the first. So you could use a colon here. Probably the best use. I mean, I guess in theory you could use a semicolon. It would be grammatically correct. I guess a comma and a conjunction would work, but in this case, the most effective use is a colon. You would never have to choose among those 3 because they're all basically grammatically okay, but do know that this is acceptable use of a colon. We can also use colons to introduce short explanatory statements, such as, that day I saw the most amazing thing in the world. So notice this is a complete sentence. That day I saw the most amazing thing in the world. And then, what did I see? Colon, a skateboarding penguin. You can also use colons to introduce a quote. So my dad always said, never get involved in a land war in Asia. That a little bit breaks the first rule where this isn't exactly a complete sentence. My dad always said what, but this is a kind of an edge case specific usage when you're going to use a colon to introduce a quote. Very unlikely you will actually see this on the SAT, but I included it just to be thorough. Let's look at some example questions where it's not just about colons, but it's actually about semicolons, commas, all that punctuation stuff. So 16, we'll start from here. But Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw, in the original semicolon, the dark snow problem. So we look at the semicolon, we realize that this would have to be a complete sentence, and it is not, right? The dark snow is not a complete sentence, but it is actually, if we go back to our little list up here, it is one of those short explanatory statements, right? It's giving us what the factor is that added to the early thaw. So we like this colon, we like that in choice C. In B, we have at least an it was, I guess, and it was the dark snow problem, which would, I guess, be somewhat of a complete sentence. But when we have a semicolon, we don't want to combine it with a fanboys conjunction. So you would not ever have comma, semicolon and, semicolon but, semicolon so, semicolon for, would never work. So we would get rid of B. And then in D, sure, we've got the colon, which is good, but the being the dark snow problem. Being is a word that, this is more something that saw on the old SAT, but it seems to appear here occasionally. Being is almost always wrong. And we could just generalize this to say, as we've discussed previously, the shorter answer is generally the best answer. So if you had to choose between C and D, you would go with C because it's shorter, fewer words. The SAT likes that. So here we go with choice C. 32. Over time, I've gotten to know several of my co-working colleagues, another website developer, a graphic designer, a freelance writer, and several mobile app coders. So here we have a colon. This opening part is a complete sentence, independent clause, which is great. So we can use a colon here. And we use this colon to introduce a list. So we're actually happy with the original. This goes on model number 1, right? Introduce a list of things. A semicolon is not going to work because this is not a complete sentence. It's just a list of people. A comma is not going to work because a comma can't introduce a list like this. You have to introduce it with a colon or some other phrasing. A comma isn't good enough, and no punctuation is even worse because then you've just kind of smashed, it's not a run-on, but you've smashed these two things together, a list and a complete sentence where it's unclear how it's punctuated. So we definitely prefer something like choice A.